Hey folks, I'm Spencer, and on today's episode of Cult Mania we're going to be looking at one of, if not the most controversial movies of all time, Ruggero Deodato's Cannibal Holocaust. Deodato's film was a follow-up to his first cannibal film, Last Cannibal World. Cannibal films were all the rage at this point in time, whether from an Italian background or some far less successful Spanish attempts. But I would argue that Cannibal Holocaust is probably the most famous cannibal film, partly because of its prominence on the DPP's Video Nasties list, and because Deodato got arrested by the Italian courts because they thought it was a snuff film, not helped by the fact that he'd told a bunch of the cast members to disappear for a little while to help the film's publicity. The film's plot follows a documentary film crew who've gone missing in the jungle after they attempted to film a group of cannibalistic tribes that have never been seen by outsiders, or at least not by any that have managed to come back and tell anyone about it. Professor Monroe, an anthropologist played by Robert Kerman, travels into the same jungle in an attempt to find the film crew. But once he's stumbled across the tribe, all he does is find that that film crew are incredibly, incredibly dead and incredibly, incredibly eaten. Monroe manages to acquire the footage, bringing it back to a New York lab to be developed, and then it's supposed to be being put into a TV programme. But it's quickly discovered that these documentary people were very, very nasty people, and it's probably not a good idea for this to be shown. We're then shown this footage just to see just how horrible they are. And I think this is probably one of the first uses of found footage in a film. The acting in this film is pretty good. I mean, you do get the usual, a lot of stuff is dubbed in the way that pretty much all Italian splatter films are, and it does add some weird moments to a couple of scenes, but I don't think it's particularly intrusive. I stopped noticing it if it was particularly bad. This is mainly because you are going to be so angry with every character in this film that you won't care what the words are coming out of their mouth. You'll just be waiting for them to die horribly. The only character in this that you will care about is Monroe, because at least he's conflicted about what he's seen. He's not particularly happy about seeing people dying. He's not particularly out to harm the tribe. He's just quite a nice person with some morals, which is nice. And I actually think Robert Kerman is really good in this film. I mean, he was a porno performer before this, with a lovely porno tash. But I think he's genuinely really good in this film. He's actually likeable. And that is so, so important, because I don't think you would actually want to watch the film if there were no likeable characters. He's sort of very good at bringing you out of this horrible moral downward spiral. And I think it's a real shame that being in this film and being in porn stopped him becoming a much more mainstream actor, because I think he's really good, and I think it's really sad that his career never went anywhere and he just got stuck in doing a couple more cannibal films.
I can't understand the reason for such cruelty.
I think it's also interesting that the indigenous tribes people are actually, for the most part, actual indigenous tribes people. And I think the film's treatment of the tribes as a whole is quite interesting. Yes, there are some very, very brutal things that they do. There are some incredibly horrific things. But it's always justified in a way of, you know, this is how these people have lived their lives for centuries now. This is, you know, their rituals. No one else, no other horrible acts of violence by any civilised people is ever given any justification. I mean, you could say that, you know, we are being shown this other to fear, but I don't know. I think there is a genuine sort of an amount of affection for the tribes that you're almost siding with them far more than anyone else. I know this is going to sound very strange, but Cannibal Holocaust is a very, very gorgeous film. I upgraded to a HD copy to watch this. I'd seen it on a really scuzzy DVD. And it really does look stunning. I think, being filmed in the jungles, I think they were mainly in Colombia. Low budget films don't look like this anymore. And I really miss it because it does look absolutely stunning. The film's cinematography is sort of split into two halves. You have the start of the film, which is much more sort of cinematic. You get a lot of sort of lovely... You're getting really, really close up into things and, being right in the middle of the grue. Or you're getting these lovely wide shots of the jungles and the indigenous people's homes. And it just looks stunning. I mean, I don't know how much set design was done for the film or how much was just there when they got there. But it always looks great. And then, obviously, you're going to go into the more famous part of the film, the found footage stuff. Now, how many found footage films feel so limited by that style? This doesn't have that. I think it helps because in the terms of the plot, the film is being edited. There are two cameras being constantly cut together, so you still have this kinetic energy. You've got multiple points of view, so it still feels very filmy, but it's got this lovely grotty. The colour grading is ever so slightly different when we're in the world of found footage. And I don't know, I just really got sucked into it. Even though you're constantly being interrupted seeing it by more standard shots, it does have this really realistic feeling, and that just adds to the uncomfortable nature of it. I think there's some great moments where they edit in, like, that you've got light leaks and the footage is damaged, or the leader that goes between them sort of pops up briefly, and it does just have that feeling of you've found this horrible grotty footage. It doesn't feel overly produced. I think it's very interesting that obviously the film opens with score, and then the found footage is able to have a score because it is put with stock music by the editor. This music comes from Ritz Ortolani, and I have to say, the soundtrack for this film is fabulous. It's very, very strange to hear it on an album, and I think if you heard it on here first, you'd be very, very confused as to what the film's going to sound like, but it all works in film. I mean, the main theme is this sort of mix of acoustic guitar, and you've got these strings and these strange warbly synth, and it's just beautiful. It's played to start with over the opening credits, which is just shots of the lovely jungle scenery, but then it's used over some really emotional, quite violent moments, and it just creates this beautiful juxtaposition, especially compared to how it was used prior. And then you have these sort of incredibly distressing tracks like Adulterous Punishment, which is this sort of incredibly low synth which just seems to like hit you in your chest if you have it loud enough, with these so somber strings. I think this is the most important part. The film always has this somber, quite depressing feeling to the score, at least when it's doing the horror moments. It does have some weird sort of jazzy numbers that, in terms of the soundtrack album, feel really out of place, but they're usually used in the background or for some of the New York sequences. And when you hear it on the album, there are these incredibly strange noises which feel incredibly grating and don't feel like they're the sort of thing that should be in a horror score, especially one that's trying to be depressing. But in the film, they work, you don't really notice them. Overall, I would say that the soundtrack is just this sort of beautiful mixture of, well, of beauty and horror, which perfectly sums up a lot of what you're seeing on screen. You're in these beautiful locations watching these incredibly horrible things happen. Now, on to the reason, of course, that the film is so controversial. All of its violence. I mean, the film is littered with horrific acts. I mean, obviously, it's a cannibal film. You have a lot of gut munching going on. This stuff is all really quite disturbing still. It still packs quite a punch. The effects, especially when people are sort of throwing around giblets and stuff, which all to me look incredibly real. I'm presuming they are. The fake blood on them is incredibly good. It's incredibly dark, because there was one shot early on with like a knife wound, and I was like, "Ooh, that blood doesn't look very real. Perhaps this hasn't aged as well as I thought." No, it has. It's still incredibly gruey. Even when we get into more of the, lopping off limbs and stabbings and beatings and pretty much anything that you can come up with, it's in this film, and it all is still really, really shocking. All the effect work is really solid. If it isn't, you get the sense that someone knew it wasn't, so they didn't pay too much attention to filming it. And I think it's really important that the film is filmed in such a way that the violence is always treated in this very cold, you can't do anything about it, it's just happening, and that makes you angry because you want to stop it. This is incredibly important when it comes to the sexual violence that is in the film. There is a lot. If this is something that bothers you, please, please, please do not watch this film, because it is so distressing. The adulterous scene especially, which it's far worse than I'd remembered it being. And I think it's incredibly effectively shot because it is distressing, and I think it is intended to be. There is nothing erotic about any of the sexual violence. It is punishing to watch, which I think, there are a lot of films at this time that you worry about them wandering into a sort of titillating style. This film doesn't have any of that, but it is hard going. Now, of course, we come to the sort of infamous animal cruelty sequences. These are also incredibly hard to watch, incredibly hard to stomach, especially these days, because they're just not something we have anymore. Apparently, they were put in mainly to appeal to an East Asian audience. I don't know how true this is. I don't know if that's people trying to sort of pass the buck. Although the film was, in 1983, the second highest grossing film in Japan, behind E.T. Fun fact. No, these scenes are incredibly hard to watch. You can find copies of the film that will have an uncut version and a cut version that just takes out the animal stuff. I don't know whether those exist with a fully uncut version of the rest of the film. But no, they are incredibly difficult to watch. They're sort of also paired with real life human atrocities. There is a Last Road to Hell sequence, if you ever see anything about that. That has real execution footage in it. It's not as graphic as the animal cruelty, but there are these sort of heavy, real acts of violence which I'm not going to justify, but I'm going to say why I think they were put in this film. Now, there are going to be some spoilers in this little discussion, but they need to be there for me to be able to put my point across properly. Whilst I have seen people say this film is based on a real, documentary crew that went in to see a cannibalistic tribe and were eaten and someone got the footage, Deodato himself has said that the film was inspired by him walking in and seeing his son watching an incredibly grisly news report, and that the film is about how the media take atrocities from around the world and turn them basically into entertainment. Now, there is the thing of, he has put news footage of atrocities in his entertainment film, he has put animal atrocities in his entertainment film, but I think viewing it as just being you're feeding into the problem is reductive, because, the film beats you over its head with its message. Characters frequently drop plot exposition that is telling you that you should be outraged that this sort of thing happens in reality. The use of animal cruelty, whilst you can never justify it, I'm sort of going to try. I think the animal cruelty in the film really helps to make the impact of the faked violence feel all that more real, because you are conflating this faked violence with the real violence that is 100% real. This gives you a gut reaction to every piece of violence in the film, whether it is a beating or sexual violence. It really sort of you merge the anger that you have towards, oh my god, these animals were killed, to, oh my god, why is no one stopping this, or why are the camera crew doing these horrible acts? And I think this plays very much into, there is this constant sense of viewership. Every act of violence is being watched by someone in the film, and it is not being acted upon. We have a sexual assault that Monroe's guide stops him interfering in and sort of takes glee in watching this action take place. You have another scene of sexual assault in which the camera crew are constantly passing the camera to one another so they can take their own turn, which is so rage-inducing. Similarly, you know, all of the documentary footage is being watched by people. I mean, it's being watched by multiple generations of people. You have one of the camera crew being eaten or being, again, sexually assaulted, which is being watched by other members of the camera crew that are filming it, which is then being watched by the television executives, which is then being watched by us. It's this constant people watching this and letting it happen. And I think this does help to stir up emotions in the audience. It is impossible not to become sort of engaged with the film. And I think that allows, when Monroe gets his last line of, "Who are the real cannibals?" it means that everything that you felt hits you right there. It's this, you're able to have a cerebral response to the film because you are having such a visceral response, that you are so aware of everything around you that it is impossible for the message not to hit you. Now, for me, I think this is one of the most interesting horror films, actually just films out there. I think, you know, there is so much writing you could do. I could do countless videos going into more depth on, especially what I've said in the last paragraph. It's such a hard film to watch. It still packs all of the emotion. The trauma of watching this film is so intense that I know that probably 90% of the people that are watching me talk right now either couldn't stomach it or would be outraged by it, and I think that is 100% fair. But I really do think it is a step above a lot of other sort of crass, offensive, overly gory horror films of this time, and that have come out far more recently, Serbian films and all, because it really does have something to say, and it doesn't take any interpreting. It fully commits to this idea of what does civilised mean, what role does media play in, you know, promotion of violence and atrocity. I don't think it does it perfectly. I think you can pull it apart, but it has a crack at some incredibly difficult subject matter so incredibly early. You know, there are films that still attempt to discuss these themes, and I don't think they do it as well as this film. But I understand that that message could, you know, is perhaps undone by how shocking it is, that the film is sort of too impenetrable. But that is just my opinion. What do you think of Cannibal Holocaust? Do you think it's intellectual and great, like I've said, or do you think it's just a scuzzy, horrible film that no one should ever watch and should have been set fire to? Let me know down in the comments, like and subscribe so that you don't miss any more videos, and I shall see you next time.